Most people around the world don't realize that what we take for granted, there's basic assumptions about what we are as human beings and where we are in the universe, is actually the result of one very specific culture that developed basically in early modern Europe around the time of the scientific revolution. But it had deep roots from ancient Greek culture or whatever. But it was very specific to this one time and place. But because of the force of imperialism and colonialism, it's basically spread around the world. So now people just take it for granted. But this worldview that we take for granted, it says things like humans are fundamentally selfish, that humans are separate from nature. And it sees nature as something that isn't alive, it's just basically a resource for exploitation. And so all of these things go through our fundamental way of looking at life, and technology is really arising as to manipulate or sort of conquer nature, which was a phrase that came from the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon. And so one of the things that's really helpful, and that book kind of looked at, is that by seeing that other cultures have made sense of the universe in different ways over time and in different places, it helps us to realize that actually we are looking at the whole world through a lens. We don't realize that. We think this is the way the world is. But once you realize that you're making sense of it through a particular lens, that kind of frees us up, because then you can kind of walk away from that lens and look through the world at another lens and say, oh, it looks different this way, and begin to get a wider perspective of the possibilities. I think that what we need to do is when we begin to look at the world from a different lens, and that different lens can be, it's available in so many different ways. It can be from indigenous populations. It can be from different traditions such as Buddhism or Taoism or whatever it might be. Or it may even be from a scientifically driven lens, but one that looks at the world from our deep interconnectedness and looks at how we evolved as human beings from evolutionary biology, things like that. We begin to see that deep interconnectedness is the thing that each of these other lenses hold in common, that our dominant worldview completely dismisses, that our very identity is not as a separate individual, but arises from our community, arises from our relationship with all of life, that are from an evolutionary basis. There are, like indigenous peoples around the world talk about non-humans as our relatives, which is kind of scoffed at by a typical modern scientist or reductionist. And actually, we discover from evolutionary biology, we are all relatives on this earth. We share about half of our DNA with a banana. I mean, we're all part of that same living unfolding of life. And so that then leads, like almost directly, to this drive towards community. Because once we realize that so much of our sense of alienation, so much of what is destroying human well-being and the living earth right now is that separation from each other, that separation from the earth, we get to see, oh, we can actually reconnect with our humanity by connecting with community, by like opening up to the natural world around us, by seeing our very identity itself, not necessarily avoiding our identity as separate individuals, but seeing that there's also an identity of a shared community, our shared humanity that we share with all of life. And that expands our sense of possibility. And at the same time as it expands our sense of possibility, it almost drives us towards engaging for life. Because once we begin to identify in that way, we realize life is under attack from this civilization right now. Our sense of human justice and fairness is under attack. So it drives us naturally to want to do something different. A part of what this dominant worldview says is, well, humans are just selfish. And once you start from that basis, you begin to realize, you begin to sort of get to the place of, well, I guess it's inevitable. And you can get into this sort of tragic flaw. I mean, a lot of people end up in this place. Like, it's just the great tragedy, this humanity. We just evolved to develop technology, to destroy our own. There's nothing we can do. And there leads to a sense of inevitability. And that's all based on false understanding of who we are as human beings. If you actually, and this is what evolutionary biologists and anthropologists have shown us, if you look at other primates, it is actually true that most of the primates do have this alpha male who wants to control the rest of the primates in the tribe. As humans, when we sort of split off from our primate lineage millions of years ago in the savannah, we were in a much more dangerous and changeable environment. And those groups that learned how to cooperate better together were the ones that actually survived. So in the millions of years that like the hominids evolved to become human beings, we developed what are called moral emotions, where we actually started to feel within us a sense of community or a sense of shame if we did something that broke our community's values, a sense of caring for our community, a sense of caring, loving people that were generous and spirits. And we actually evolved community-based ways of if some sort of more primal-based alpha male in the community started to get too big for his britches. As a community, we developed skillful social technologies to actually push that person down through mockery or through actually grouping together against that person to actually keep a more stable and community-based society. And so humans, if you look to indigenous values, which is much closer to how we humans actually evolved. And those values are based on relationship. They're based on relationship, reciprocity, redistributing. If somebody ends up with more, even more physical strength or whatever, they then want to share it with others. And what's so important about this is people often think when they hear these things, oh, well, I'd have to lose my sense of individuality, like give myself up to the Borg or whatever, be part of community. Actually, what Indigenous people often point out is that you can actually develop your sense of individuality in a more full way when it's expressed within the community. So it's not community versus your individuality, it's your individuality allowing a fuller expression as part of who you're connected with. So often people think that there's this, is the human fate to just destroy the earth or whatever. But what we actually see when we look again at how indigenous societies developed around the world, well, interestingly, there is some element of truth to the fact that as humans developed powers of technology, bows and arrows, or learning to work together to create nets, or to actually become more powerful than even the most powerful mammals around, other than humans, and as we moved out of Africa, it's actually true that as we moved to different continents around the world, that did lead to mass extinction of megafaunas, like the largest animals, just incredible, like almost like creatures that seem mythological in North America, South America, Australia, wherever humans went. Many of those big special mammals ended up going extinct usually within a few thousand years. So people can point to that and say, yeah, well, see, this is why humans can't coexist. But what happened was, over time in all these different places, gradually over generations, the indigenous people, probably most likely from the elders, noticing what was happening and passing wisdom down to younger generations, they developed ways of living in community that did become fully sustainable. And not just sustainable, but in many cases regenerative with the other plants and fauna and flora in the actual continents where they lived. So if you look at almost every surviving traditional community around the world has very strong cultural values not to exceed their natural abundance of what's around. So it might be different seasons for fishing salmon, say in the northwest coast of North America, in Aboriginal territories. They'll actually create nets to capture fish where they'll make sure the nets are a big enough size so only the really biggest fish get stuck in the net and the smaller ones that still need to grow further get free. So there's all these different ways of being that indigenous cultures around the world developed to actually be in a synergistic relationship with the natural world. So if we can learn that actually and apply those lessons to our modern civilization, we can transform the very notion of technology itself. and start to ask not kind of how can we develop the next technological innovation to become more efficient in how we consume the earth, or to make the next billionaire to come up with some tweak or whatever, but actually ask the question, how can we develop technology to be in the service of all life? How can we learn to be in relationship with nature in a way that is mutually beneficial, good for us and good for the natural world? And that's where we can learn so much from indigenous wisdom. One of the principles of permaculture is that notion of observing where you are. And permaculture itself developed its principles to a large degree from what was learned from the indigenous ways of being with the land. And the founders readily acknowledge some of that. So what we get there is, to your point, it's a feedback, real-time feedback based on our actual relationship with the land. And again, as humans, we evolved to be in relationship with the land. So a lot of what has happened in this dominant worldview is this utter separation of our lived experience with the food that we eat, with the people around us, with the land that produces all that for us by the way we work with it. So that's where localization is absolutely an essential part of shifting our orientation towards what I and other people increasingly call this possibility of an ecological civilization, like transforming the basis of our civilization from one that is based on extraction and exploitation to one that's actually based on affirming life, on setting the conditions for everybody to flourish on a regenerated earth. And that begins, one of the fundamental features of that is called subsidiarity, is pushing power and decision-making down to the lowest possible level in the system, which leads naturally to localization. How can technology actually be in the service of life? And this is a really interesting question because it's been looked at so little. But there are ways in which we can recognize some of the ways in which that can be. We can use, for example, we can use technology to understand, say, in the most local thing imaginable, basically like agroecology and working on our one particular plot of land. There are ways to use technology now, just innovative ways that are just being developed, and they haven't been developed in the past simply because they're not profitable enough, because they don't lead to the next billionaire getting minted. But there's ways to use geological types of technologies to understand the particular makeup of a particular plot of land and feel into what kind of crops would actually thrive there the best, what kind of cycling would lead to the richest regeneration of that land. And there's ways we can basically use technology to get a deeper understanding of the human relationship with the land. And we can also, some of the larger technologies that involve like global understanding of our systems, they're very important to get global feedback effects. Because while localization is the beginning and source of what an ecological civilization would be about, we also need to remember that when there's billions of us humans on the planet, no matter how carefully we might want to be doing things, there are global effects of what we're doing. So technologies such as the technologies that geoscientists use right now to monitor like the way that we're breaking through our planetary boundaries are absolutely critical for just a different kind of feedback effect, but one that is just as important in a global setting. And communication technologies like the internet, when it first got formed, it's utterly exciting breakthrough for the ability for humans to connect with each other in a way that had never been able to happen before around the world. That got hijacked by global capitalism, because any technology that is developed within our global capitalist framework will always, it's almost like a fundamental law the more effective and beneficial that technology might be, the more likely it is to get captured by global capitalism to then manipulate those benefits for the sake of a few wealthy billionaires and shareholders. Um, but when you look at the actual potential of the internet, this enables this incredible distributed intelligence to arrive for humanity. And in technology right now, to going to that next level, a lot of people at the cutting edge of like Web 3.0 is called, looking at things like distributed autonomous organizations or DAOs to actually explore different forms of ownership, different forms of truly distributed power to human beings to make decisions and to actually give shared ownership out of that kind of dominant corporate control. So that's where I think it's so important to embrace technology, but fundamentally, for anybody who's coming up with some new technological innovation, to realize that if you begin to develop that technology within the context of some shareholder-owned company, and you say, I'm going to do good, I'm not going to sell out like those other people, but the more successful that you get, the more the pressures on that selling out become overwhelming. So no matter what your intentions, starting from that structure will almost inevitably lead in the wrong direction. But you can start from a worker co-op basis. You can develop technologies based on commons infrastructures, where right from the outset, the ownership is fully distributed. So from my own personal perspective, the first half of my adult life was actually spent in the business world. I got an MBA, and then I became a management consultant. Then I got into technology, and I actually founded one of the first internet companies during that first dot-com boom. And I founded the first company that allowed people to actually apply for credit cards online, get approved in real time, and design their own image on their card. It was so exciting. Took the company public, and then my wife at the time, she passed away some years back. She got actually very quite sick overall, and then developed a lung illness that led to her death a number of years later. I left the company to look after her, but I left the company before it was really ready to actually let it go. And within a couple of years, everything collapsed. It went from the dot-com boom to being part of the dot-com bust a couple of years later. And then as I started to look after my wife who passed, I realized it's as though everything in my life had crashed around me. I left the company, and it collapsed basically within a couple of years. I was looking after my wife at the time, who passed away, and she began to lose some of her cognitive clarity. And I began to lose my relationship with her, even as I was looking after her for years. So what I went through is a sense of kind of as if everything had crashed around me. And so it was like a real a melting pot, like a crucible. And at that time, I made this determination that whatever I did with my life going forward would be truly meaningful. And because I felt that what I had done so far in my life wasn't that meaningful. And I sensed that it would have been taking me away from what really mattered to me. But I didn't want to take somebody else's word for it. So I started this process that took 10, 15 years of looking at the different ways in which meaning arose in the world and all the concepts we take for granted, whatever human uniqueness or a concept of God or religion or a separation between science and spirituality, whatever it was. Where did these ideas come from? So that's actually led me to my own journey of discovery, led me to write books like The Patterning Instinct, which was this cultural history book. And then after that, the book that followed called The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. That really was where I came to after years of my own, not just intellectual journey of discovery, but an embodied one including things like learning meditation and Taoist practices and Qigong, etc., to realize that actually so many of these distinctions we make in our modern world today are completely false. They're between what is scientific and rational and what is felt in our bodies and what is spiritual. So as part of that, began to cause me to look back at what I had done in that first part of my life. And it took a few years to really look at it from the fullest point of view, to see that I had been part of this destructive system. That what I had done was nothing to be proud of. On the total opposite, I had been part of leading people to take out more debt, and realized that actually I had been rationalizing to myself that I was doing good. I would kind of believe it in myself, and maybe there were layers that didn't believe it. I just wouldn't go there. We're enabling people to meet their dreams and help them to take out debt so they can. So there's ways that you can rationalize what you're doing, and of course, corporations are magnificently great at that. Almost every corporation has got some nice, cute logo and some nice little, few words that they developed after probably spending $50 million or $100 million with some, consulting marketing firms, saying, helping the world be a better place, or helping for a cleaner future, or whatever they came up with that might just disguise the drastic and disastrous work they're doing of exploiting and extracting basically human behavior and the earth. So what that's led me to understand, and in fact, one of the things that I would see as fundamental to an ecological civilization is that large corporations, they must have what's known as a triple bottom line. Like right now, corporations can choose to become what is known as a B Corp or a benefit corp, which basically means that they have to change their charter. So they have to take into account, the reason it's called triple bottom line is because it refers to people, planet, and profit. So those are the three Ps, basically. But also things like suppliers or the constituencies or consumers, that take into account all constituencies of what the company does. But it's a choice. So it's had virtually no impact on our actual system, because none of these big corporations would do it. Even if there was a CEO who wanted to feel his company was doing good, his board of directors and shareholders would say, well, you do that and the rest of our competitors don't do that. It's not a level playing field. We're going to lose out. So, well, our shareholder price will go down. You can't do that. So even good people in those companies, their hands are tied. But if we actually pass laws across the board requiring companies to have their triple bottom line, and only to allow their charters to be renewed, say every 5 years, if they met those triple bottom lines. And that determination to be made not by just some regulator who's part of a revolving door, so he becomes the next CEO the next time around, but actually by a panel of the people who are affected by the company, chosen by sortition, so that which is just the way we choose jurors. Like, so the corporation can't like bribe some group to make sure it gets its way. And if this was done properly, it would keep a level playing field, all corporations on the same field, but change the very DNA of companies, so that they actually did have to bring all these ideas, all these different values into play. So then shareholder analysts, the analysts who determine the stock price by saying, oh, right now they just look at things like how profitable is the company going to be, in the next year. But if they were looking at the risk of companies having social bankruptcy or environmental bankruptcy in addition to financial bankruptcy, everything would change. They'd start saying, well, we're worried that Amazon might have to declare social bankruptcy because the way they treat their employees is abysmal. And everything would change in the way that Amazon CEOs made those decisions. And to your original point, most people in corporations are not bad people at all. Like, people want to do good. And oftentimes people will accept if the company says you're doing good here and there, they'll accept that because they want to feel they're doing good. And all the way to the very top levels of the company, I actually believe that most CEOs would even actually embrace something like that if it was forced on them, because then they could feel they're actually working for the benefit of their kids, their grandchildren, and the world around them. And in fact, it would make life a lot more interesting in corporations. Rather than having one simple bottom line, you'd have to think the way we do when we have relationships with people. How am I affecting this person? I want this from that person. But on the other hand, I've got these values. That doesn't feel good. And we make decisions when we interact with other people based on complexity. All of a sudden, that kind of complexity would be part of the corporate mindset. The localization movement has done great work in showing the corrosive and incredibly dangerous effect of these globalized local treaties, which oftentimes gives corporations the right to actually sue local governments if they try to pass laws that protect the very health and benefits of their citizens. So there's been these egregious cases where a country might want to force tobacco manufacturers to put a warning label on their cigarettes. And then they're threatened with this massive lawsuit by the company saying that their profits are going to be undermined by that. And so, just things countries want to do for the benefit of their people, oftentimes these companies are bigger in size than the very countries that are trying to look after their people. Like right now, if you look at the 100 largest economies in the world today, 69 of those 100 are not nation states, but these transnational corporations. They have a stranglehold over basically every aspect of our global society, not just business, but our media, our politics, our finance, our mining, our agriculture, and almost every part of the human experience is dominated not by by governments, whether they're democratically elected or not, but actually by corporations that by definition have a different orientation, a different endpoint to raise shareholder value rather than to look out for the benefit of human beings. You can check out ongoing conversations about this at the Deep Transformation Network, which you can find very easily at deeptransformation.network. And there's thousands of people from around the world having conversations like this. In fact, the tagline of the community is exploring pathways toward an ecological civilization. So people should feel free to join us there. I definitely see a growth in this thinking, and I see some very hopeful signs of a sense of planetary consciousness, of us really connected with others around the world, and also a local consciousness, sometimes known as cosmo-local consciousness. And I feel that is increasing more and more. The question that none of us have an answer to is that increasing at a fast enough rate to actually shift the trajectory of this dominant this kind of machine that's driving us towards a precipice this century. None of us know that, but my belief is that our only hope of averting a real catastrophic outcome to this century is if enough of us actually feel into these values we're talking about of deep connectedness, and in addition to really orienting our own lives towards doing what we know is needed, like locally and together and in our communities. Also making bridges, looking at what others are doing around us and amplifying the work of others. So as a coherent, cohesive global network of change, we might develop enough power to make that transformation happen in time.